It is Thursday, November 11th, 2010. My name is Jason Moreland, and thanks for stopping in for another 28storms.com weather update. Currently, there's not a whole lot to talk about in the Atlantic Basin, although that may begin to change in a few days. Currently, there is a weak surface trough that extends from the Greater Antilles southwestward toward Colombia, where there is some disorganized convection, but it's rather disorganized, like I said, and conditions really aren't all that favorable for tropical development in the short term. As you can see by the water vapor image, there's this huge central Atlantic trough that just continues to dip down, and that's ushering in a lot of dry air and vertical wind shear. As you can see, any convection that does develop in this area, its cloud tops begin to get blown off to the northeast fairly quickly, so conditions aren't all that favorable right now. However, there is some upper level ridging further toward the east. This is the Lesser Antilles in this general vicinity, and we're using maps from the SIMS website. It's a very reliable website that you may want to visit one day. Anyway, there's some fairly hefty subtropical ridging in this area, and it can also be seen using this map. As you can see, the darker blues represent wind shear values of less than 10 to 15 knots, which is fairly favorable for tropical development, but points further west are still fairly unfavorable with a lot of vertical wind shear. With all that being said, several model guidance shows that area of high pressure beginning to expand further west, and the upper levels along the central and western Caribbean may become more favorable with time. And as we set this in motion, you'll notice that upper level ridging does become more of a factor south of Cuba, south of Jamaica, and into the southwest Caribbean over the next 6 days. As a result, the GFS forecast model is developing low pressure south of Jamaica by 126 hours. And we'll actually loop this entire animation so that you can see everything. This is starting now, and there's really not much to speak of, but by days 4 and 5 you begin to see that surface low reflection, and then the model shows a general northwest movement through day 6. The Canadian model shows much of the same. You'll begin to see low pressure form in this general vicinity, and it actually develops what amounts to be a tropical storm that eventually makes landfall along the coast of Nicaragua. So the bottom line, there's really not that much to speak of right now, but if any tropical development were to occur in the Atlantic Basin over the next week or so, it will be in this general vicinity. So interest in the West Caribbean, do want to keep an eye on the weather just in case something were to form. As for interest in the United States, the chances of anything impacting your weather from this system are pretty low, considering that this is still about 6 days from even forming. In this time of the year, we normally start to have a lot of troughs dipping into the eastern United States, and that has been the case so far, and there's really no sign of that pattern beginning to change anytime soon. But, as always, we'll continue to keep a close watch on this area. Turning to our weather here in the United States, the pattern's been fairly stable, and it hasn't been willing to change all that much over the last several days. We've had a fairly large long wave trough of low pressure continuing to extend into the western United States, while the southeast United States remains relatively clear of any precipitation thanks to this persistent area of mid-level strong positive heights that extend well into the Ohio Valley and into the southeast Canada and the Great Lakes region. With time, however, that long wave trough over the western United States is going to begin to shift east. This is the 500 millibar forecast from the GFS, and as you can see, there is the shortwave trough that extends down into Arizona and New Mexico. But as we move into time, it starts to shift east. This is Friday afternoon, and the trough is now centered over the Texas Panhandle, upward into the central and northern plains. Out ahead of that trough of low pressure, there's going to be the tendency for surface low formation, thanks to a lot of divergence in the upper layers of the atmosphere. And moving along into Saturday, that surface low pressure becomes well defined with a cold front draped further down to the south, and in fact it almost extends into the northwest Gulf of Mexico. And this is moving into Saturday afternoon, so if you live along Memphis to Shreveport, Houston, Galveston, even down into Corpus Christi and Brownsville, you have a pretty good chance of precipitation this weekend. Especially Saturday afternoon, you're probably looking at about a 50 to 70% chance of rainfall. The rest of the southeast looks relatively dry, at least for the daytime hours on Saturday, but that begins to change as the cold front continues eastward. And in fact, as we begin to look at the start of the work week next week, Monday morning, the GFS is forecasting the formation of a secondary low pressure center. And it becomes easier to see by Tuesday morning. It's becoming more well organized over southwest Georgia, the Florida Panhandle near Destin, Sandestin, Tallahassee, into Dothan. And that's in response to a continuation of very strong divergence aloft as that trough begins to swing further east over the eastern half of the United States. So there's no reason to believe that surface low pressure won't form once again over the Gulf Coast states. We can get some isolated thunderstorms and possibly some damaging winds here and there, but overall this does not look like it's going to be much of a severe weather outbreak, even though this low pressure begins to deepen as it extends further east into the Carolinas, where it deepens to 1,008 millibars. I've looked at some of the severe weather parameters, and the main thing going against this setup is that there just isn't enough instability. So bottom line is, the southeast has been experiencing wonderful weather over the last few weeks with little to no precipitation, but at the same time we really need the rainfall because it's been a while since we've had any significant measurable rain. And it looks like we're going to get 2 rounds of that, one coming in through this weekend, and possibly some precipitation persisting for the first half of the work week next week, especially if you're within the eastern half of the southeast United States. And also we'll keep an eye on the tropics, especially the West Caribbean. So that's a wrap up of today's weather. Check back in again tomorrow for another weather update from 28storms.com.